Today I want to begin a long conversation with listeners, which will continue without end, until the logical conclusion, until the end of my life. This conversation is very important, where we'll talk about the most important works of piano literature. Today, I want to start with Mussorgsky's remarkable pictures at an exhibition, which needs a very big rethinking. I'm absolutely convinced that listeners should be trained to understand the music that they're going to listen to. Do we need to explain the music? I often hear such a question. This is not quite the right question, not quite the right understanding of the task of the musician and artist, who gives a glimpse into his workshop or his studio to his esteemed public. This is not an explanation of music. It is a completely different process. You cannot explain the music, because it speaks for itself. Also, it is impossible, and it's not necessary. But it's absolutely necessary to know and understand how music works. I take this word in quotes, of course. To perform serious music properly, and to fully convey the composer's intention, the performer must understand precisely the musical world, language, thoughts, and emotions of the composer that being presented to his intended audience. This is a very exciting moment, a living moment of communication with the living soul of the composer, which is left to us in his live music forever. In this case of serious works, and especially with great compositions filled with endless meanings, special preparations must be undertaken by the performer and the listener alike to fully understand the composer's inner world. The lack of such practice, the training of listeners and even professionals, has led the musical world to the fact that the performers themselves sometimes perform a work for centuries and at the same time still don't know it fully. And as such, they make mistakes in interpreting the meanings, misunderstand the principles upon which the music is built, its underlying laws and intended narrative. Let's try to break the vicious traditions. Fortunately, in our time, and only in our time, it has become possible for musicians to appeal directly to public from their home, their workshops, their studio, which makes it possible to strengthen the immediacy and intimacy of the connection between the artist, his friends, and the public around the world. And most importantly, it enables us together to raise the level of performing outdated, historically outdated, intuitive, semi-shamanic level of the reflexive to the level of the modern, technologically enlightened public. A new society that lives in completely different technological era, but at the same time, culturally and spiritually, still remains a backward, archaic society. Let's try together to understand author's musical language, where each picture, each individual movement gives ample opportunities to communicate in general through his music series. That is, today, we will only tackle the beginning, the so-called promenade, the walk, the first movement of this marvelous piano symphonic work of Mussorgsky. Promenade. Mussorgsky belongs to the rarest composers, those whose music carries a very large specific weight in every bar and literally every tone. There are very few such composers, and there are not many such compositions as pictures in the piano literature either, in the whole piano literature. The significance of each tone, each modulation, each musical step is rivaled only by the best works of Schumann, the best works of Tchaikovsky, the best works of Beethoven, by virtue of the saturation of the images, wherein literature, literally every note carries an artistic meaning, an artistic load. Now, I want us together to analyze the wishes of Mussorgsky, which he writes in Italian, as it is the tradition of the composers, because all the terminology of musicians is usually written in Italian as well. What does Modest Petrovich write? He writes allegro giusto, which has two meanings: either accurately, quickly, in precise rapid movement, or, to which I'm more inclined to use, allegro giusto is a comfortable, fast movement, not too fast, not too slow. The second meaning best matches the character of the composer. So I interpret this in this sense, and the second meaning. Then he very carefully wrote the whole great phrase, what composers do very rarely when they want to be accurately and precisely understood. Further, he writes nel modo russico, in Russian. Well, since I address the Russian language to the Russian-speaking public, to the Russian-speaking audience, my friends who think in Russian, we understand each other without explanation what it means in Russian. It means broadly, with daring, chanting, and maybe somewhat disorderly. That is associated with the Russian expenses and the Russian character. Further, the most important instruction, through the comma. It follows, which tells that Mussorgsky intensely asks us, attracting our attention, focusing our attention, to concentrate on the inner world of the promenade, or in the vernacular, walking. And here we find a big discrepancy. When for 150 years musicians focus primarily on the outside, they try to illustrate and picture the gait, the body language at best. And this is more an expression of the outside world rather than that of the inside. But one way or another, they concentrate in this work mainly on the outside. The name Pictures from an Exhibition refers to artful pictures we're all familiar with. Unfortunately, such specific thinking is approaching this work, led to interpretation, led away from the inner world, led away from the main idea of Modest Petrovich, who wanted to show, of course, something entirely different here than the pictures. The pictures here only a distraction from the inner world Mussorgsky reacting to. It's just triggering his inner world. And so focusing on his inner world in his music, he willfully and unintentionally tells us about time, about life, about the customs of Russia of the mid-19th century and the whole culture that preceded it, which he absorbed into himself, rooting his experience as a native Russian man. So what is Mussorgsky asking of us? He writes senza allegrezza, which means without joy. Therefore, this desire cannot refer to external. It refers exclusively to the inner world. There can be no gait termed externally joyless. Even if we have bleak gait, a walk, that is expressing the state of our inner world, this is the most important thing that we have to concentrate on, senza allegrezza, without joy, humbly, sadly, forcing you to live and move, or maybe most likely even in this particular case referring to forcing himself to go to an exhibition, which he especially does not want to go to, because all it is exciting but at the same time tragic and not entirely pleasant. And further ask, poco sostenuto, with some restraint. Here is such a long introduction, a whole small literary introduction, which is very unusual for the composer, who is, in theory, was only to designate in a couple of words the tempo and movement, that's all. Okay, let's move on to the material itself, and we will move step by step, trying to understand what Modest Petrovich wants to express in this music. how not to make mistakes in tempo ratios, how to find the right tempo character, how to try to penetrate in the inner world of the person who is obviously hinting that he is going to expand on the state of his inner world in this music, and not at all to paint children's pictures. So, let's go into the music. The first musical theme. It is very unusual that we have a variable rhythm. 5 quarters, 6 quarters, together we get 11 quarters. What can it symbolize? There is no desire to be expressive in the quasi-national style. Through his very written, and Modest Petrovich himself admits this, the Promenade represents his physiognomy. This is his personal confession. He wrote it in the letter to his close friends. When the composer again makes such confessions, he talks about the source of inspiration. He talks about the source of what gave birth to this work. That is his physiognomy. He admits this. It's his self-portrait. This is usually never done by composers, because they do not want to be understood in such primitive way. And they do not want to fill our ears and hearts with something rooted only in basic impulses, especially when such materials forms the basis of the main impulse of this or that work. Rachmaninoff, for example, always avoided such confessions. He always believed that we should guess and understand. Shostakovich also avoided this all his life, but then very much regretted that he did not give us any clues towards the end of his life. He was very sad about it. Here Modest Petrovich says, "This is me. This is my physiognomy." Open text in his letter, "It's me. This is my face." And he says it ironically. Hence he has a self-ironical attitude to his own persona, which speaks of a high level of culture, intelligence, and developed sense of humor. Therefore, I very often draw a parallel with the great literary work of Russian Mussorgsky by Benedict Yerofeev, who is an absolute spiritual brother of this root irony, self-irony. The musical and literary trend and the view of the native Russian man on the people and on himself. So, 11 quarters. This indicates the complete disorder of the inner world, on the impossibility of putting a strong beat. It always hesitates and shifts. This meant that we immediately have an ironic self-portrait statement, where Mussorgsky says, well, yes, here I am, a Russian bear. Today is one thing, tomorrow is different, therefore 11 quavers. You see? Humpty Dumpty. How to determine the correct tempo? Obviously, if we continue to the next two measures, it's obvious we're dealing with a choral theme. He identifies his inner world, his basic mood, naturally. Being a true national representative and highly intellectual, he feels his connection with the earth. Therefore, he takes a chant, a refrain, and a chorus, which most organically conveys the basis of his character, the basis of his internal state, broad and dimensionless, using 11 quavers because he is impractical time signature.
Не имеет практически размера. Вот такой вот он широкий, вот такой вот он русский, и свое основное.
So he is so broad, he is so Russian, and his basic state, his basic of character, his spirit, he associates with Russian chant. This statement is obviously irrefutable. Therefore, we have a solo part. They brightly pronounce with a choral accompaniment. So, in choosing the tempo, we should start from that of a natural choral, Russian broad singing. And at once we will face the mistake of interpreters who, in our time, have completely forgotten about the semantic pauses that can and should be in the text depending on the musical logic. Now I turn to very important professional things. Now the chant of solo part of the chorus, so we do not miss the tempo, we should. And this does not raise any doubt that in these bars we have a vocal folk singing. It will not be challenged by anyone. No one will even try to argue with this, since it is an established fact, established by musicologists long ago. But where is the main error of the interpreters? The main mistake of interpreters is that they play the text starting from the middle of the 20th century in a row, trusting the graphics and thinking that this way they purely read a pure text, purifying it, and make a verbatim reading of the musical text. Equally bad are the romantic and incomprehensible movements from the early 20th century or the end of 19th century, all sorts of romantic and pseudo-romantic nonsenses made by ancient interpreters. We all know them from early recordings. It's just a bad taste. They were only the result of bad taste. Then in the middle of the 20th century, musicians wanted to have good taste, or quasi-good taste, and all began to read texts in a row, which turned to the fact that they, just like woodpeckers, began to chisel the graphic text, forgetting what it takes to start always from the logic of music, what it tells to us, and from the logic of the text. The logic of musical language has two hypostases. There is a logic of language, regardless of the composer, how we see here that this a choral movement in this particular case. That is a choral movement, choral singing, here already tells us one logic. And there is a second logic, the language of the author. When we know the authors personally, when we know a lot about the author's personality, when we experience the life experience of author personality, we know the logic of life, logic of his life, knowledge of the logic of life of the particular composer, narrows the possibility, when we know it, narrows the possibility of error. So, let's move on this first bars where I've been talking so long. Where is the main mistake? You cannot play a chant and chorus all at once. Just one continuum, because it's never presented this way. It does not happen physically. This contradicts the logic of the musical language. This contradicts our physiology, because the chorus has to collect air in the elementary way and then begin singing its part only after the agogical pause, following the completion of the lead part, which has been sung by the soloist. And using this analysis, first bars acquire, you can sing without swallowing phrases. But unfortunately, the traditions developed over the years don't accommodate this musical logic. The tempos is usually accelerated. It is impossible to sing extensively at these tempos. It is impossible to feel like Russian man feels what Mussorgsky wants to convey us, with all its grandness and calmness. Any of us who sings with the choir, we all know that after the song we have to turn our face to choir and the choir will respond. This means that between the first solo and choral solo there must be necessarily some logical pause, without which the music immediately loses all its meaning, and we immediately lose character and all sense. I'm not implying that many composers who did orchestration of this work were wrong, rather than that they just didn't understand what the music is about. For example, the famous orchestration of Ravel shows that he did not even understand the character of these first four bars. Instead of broad sung voice, which is the chorus, he gives the melody to the trumpet. Big mistake. He immediately transferred everything to a plain and one-dimensional coloring. The plaintive, faraway human voice of a soul, especially the soul of a Russian, cannot sound like a trumpet. The trumpet is too brash to be songful. This is flat. This is already unpleasant. A gilded golden ball, a cockerel that has nothing to do with the music of Mussorgsky's soul. It's like a cheap Russian souvenir. Then another mistake is made when the chants end. Ravel stops, and sound of trumpet, and gives development section to this stringed instrument, to the strings. Therefore, after 6 introductory ticks, where the music develops, where the flow of music, the flow of thought of the inner world of Mussorgsky should become more expansive, it's expanding. Ravel contracts its dynamic scope by giving it away to the strings. And thus there is a second big mistake. In dynamics and character, all wrong. After the bright trumpet, instead of expanding the sound, its narrowing comes, and because of the string sound, much softer. And it turns out that this coloring takes us to a completely different plane, takes us away from the intended point. And Ravel coloring, as a rule, is copied by pianists performing this part with artificial diminuendo, or rather artificial sound reduction, portraying strings, changing from the loud dynamic of the introduction to a quieter one, where it should actually be completely opposite. Mussorgsky's inner world should unfold and open up and expand, not contract. It expands in a rhythmical way, and also in sonority, similarity expands as well. Everything is expanding. So from the very beginning, from the first 6 bars, we already have 2, 3, 4, 5 errors, which leads us completely to another plane and force us to take false steps in walking the path of this work. So let's move on to the text directly. Then the soloist turns to the choir. It is very important, as I said, since every tone matters, to provide a little microdynamics. It is absolutely necessary for us to show changes in the mood in every tone, in every chord of this wonderful narrative of the inner world. That is, the major expresses certain optimism. The transition to a minor expresses doubts. A return to the major brings back hope. Then we have a distant major symbolizing some kind of a question mark. And then we return. This is an amazingly rich series of chords, which consists only of 11 chords, but it already narrates quite a bit about the immensity of the author's inner state. So now I will play it without the interruption, and I consider this necessary, and as it seems to be correctly to read this very important main statement of the beginning of the big play, the beginning of the displays of Mussorgsky musical self-portrait. very interesting remark of the author, where he, after short first expensive statements to us, reveals his soul. But suddenly, in the middle of the phrase, he breaks off, showing a pause. What does he mean by that? He wants to say that again. When he talks about his inner state, he talks about endless internal disruptions. It is so obvious, and it's a musician who must emphasize this so much as a painter, as an artist, because it's a portrait of his inner doubts. It's completely obvious. This is a very expressive paint, which is absolutely necessary to complete his portrait. At this particular point, the general narrative of his general state ends. That's a very important point. And the backbone of his character, wide, broad. In the Russian language, we have a name for this sudden change, is a spirit of break in the mood. It transliterates as avralny, literally the act of person assuming the characteristic of emergency. All hands on deck, for example. It is typical for a Russian person to quickly rethink himself, regather, to go and constantly change course for one reason or another, that there is no consistency. He again ironically tells us about his internal problems, but the general narrative of his state, his general character trait that well before begins to move into details in the middle part of the walk. When he delves into the details of his inner world, we see he breaks and separates each chord in the component intonations. What do we have here? There is, from its general state, we move into a more intimate, deeper view after the introduction. Now let us try to connect these two materials. It's very, very interesting. Just look at this. And one more very interesting detail. All of a sudden, suddenly appearing a chromatic in the middle voice. Kind of a shaky, chromatic, strange. What does it mean? Ironic. Irony and irony and irony. Self-irony. He portrays his character of insecurity, stumbling. And we can even guess, knowing his life path, knowing his negative sides that accompany his life, a certain state of some drunkenness. This is unbelievable, how he opened his heart in front of us. Then he encourages himself. And the walk continues. The movement of his character continues as well. And the last element appears very, very interesting, also very self-ironic, when he stumbles on the spot. Here you can easily see the so-called body language and character is the character of the wonderful, good-natured person who decided to undertake some specific movement. Well, let's say he decides here to take himself in hand and remember how Raphael says, "I did not go, but I got involved, since my legs did not go." So here Modest Petrovich remakes himself apparently. On one hand, it shows the outer part of the walk to the exhibition per se, and on the other hand, of course, it's part of his wonderful, amazing, charming character. And it's all ends with the first team in Promenade. And when he leaves here, he forced himself to go after the certain doubts. After the internal unpleasant and bitter reflections, which led to this turn of a minor as obeisance to the fate, drunken stamping from foot to foot, forcing himself, hurrying himself, with a shift again, a strong beat which indicates a lack of character and the total uncontrollability. No control, trampling on the spot like a bear. And finally, pulling himself together, hands reaching down the legs to the feet. And here we are, he proceeds on to the goal. Here is such a wonderful, ironic, sad and at the same time very funny, bitter and at the same time sweet, charming self-portrait, a charming physiognomy of our beloved and dear Modest Petrovich.